Your soulmate saw you last night. The shocking vision that has your soulmate in tears. Divine blessings to you, and welcome to Angel's message for you. May the peace and light of the heavens surround you in this very moment. I am so glad you have found your way here today. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt a sudden warmth in your heart for no reason at all? Or perhaps a shiver of excitement, like something wonderful is just around the corner? What if I told you that the universe has shifted and a powerful event has taken place in the spiritual realm that concerns your future? There is a secret, a whisper from the stars, that has been traveling across time and space just to find you right now. You didn't click on this by accident. Your soul guided you here because you need to hear this. Please, stay with me until the very end of this message. Do not leave early, because the promise contained in these words is the key to unlocking the happiness you have been waiting for. This is your confirmation. My dear protege, allow me to be the gentle voice that whispers in your moments of stillness. I am the bright light that guides your steps through the shadows of uncertainty. It is I, your guardian angel, who is always by your side, offering protection, love, and guidance. Today, I want to speak directly to you, heart to heart. Imagine a night so serene, so quiet, that it seemed as if the very universe was waiting for something grand. It wasn't just any night. Something moved in the shadows of reality, as if the very essence of time was holding its breath. Your person, your soulmate, was finally at peace after long days of restlessness. Then, when they closed their eyes, their soul was enveloped by a soft, almost invisible light. It was as if a curtain was slowly being lifted, revealing what had always been there, hidden, just waiting for the right moment. And then you appeared. The divine, in infinite wisdom, allowed them for a brief and powerful moment to see you as you truly are. Not as a vague memory, not as a shadow of who you could be, but as you are right now. In that instant, everything around them stopped. Time ceased to exist. They were completely, inevitably paralyzed by the beauty of your spirit. The impact was so profound that their body, even at rest, reacted. I saw it happen. I stood beside them just as I stand beside you now. Their heart raced, their breath quickened, and their eyes, even though they were closed, were flooded with a clarity that few souls ever experience. They saw you. They saw you in a way that perhaps even you cannot see yourself. They felt your soul so clearly, so powerfully, that their mind tried in vain to understand what was happening. But this kind of revelation isn't meant to be understood with the brain. It is only meant to be lived with the heart. Their journey to this moment had been long, filled with highs and lows, doubts and uncertainties. But that night, all of it seemed to fade away in the face of the vision of you. It was as if all the questions they had ever asked were answered at once with your presence. You were the answer. You always were, even when they didn't know they were asking. I saw the exact moment when their soul recognized yours. It was a moment of pure spiritual electricity, a spark that ran through every fiber of their being. It wasn't just recognition. It was certainty. They didn't need to understand the details. They didn't need words or explanations. They felt you, and that was enough to change everything. In that instant, their soul began to transform. The universe allowed them to see you because it knew they were ready. They are ready to begin a new phase of their evolution, a phase where their growth would no longer be solitary, but focused on the journey to meet you. It was as if the vision of you had ignited a flame that until then had remained sleeping, and now it burns with a clear purpose. They might not fully understand what happened yet. How could they? It wasn't an ordinary dream, the kind that fades when the sun comes up. It was a revelation, a divine promise. A promise that the moment of your meeting is near. I was there when they saw you. The impact of this revelation was so profound that I could feel the universe shift around both of you. When soulmates catch a glimpse of each other in this way, something changes on both sides, in both hearts. And I can assure you, you felt something that night too, even if you can't explain what it was. Maybe you woke up feeling different, or maybe you felt a sudden wave of comfort wash over you. They stood before you in the spiritual realm, so close it was as if they could reach out and touch your face. The emotion was so intense, so real, that it took their breath away. Their heart, which had been searching without knowing what it was looking for, now beat with a clarity that echoed across the stars. They knew it was you. It always had been. But what they saw in you was more than just the image of someone they love. They saw the reflection of your soul. They saw your pain, your struggles, your silent victories. They saw what you've kept hidden so deeply, what you've never revealed to anyone. And yet, there was no judgment. There was no fear, only love. Pure and unconditional love. Like the very love that was created between you both at the dawn of time. In that moment, they began to realize the greater purpose behind everything they have been through. All the scars they carry in their soul, all the tears they have shed, they were preparing them for this moment for you. And now that knowledge consumes them, they are evolving in a way that they might not even fully understand yet. Every step they take now is leading them directly to you. And the same is happening with you, my dear one. I can see the two of you coming closer, like two lines slowly moving toward a final meeting point. They are nearer than ever, and you are also getting closer to finding them, even if sometimes the path feels long and lonely. I know you feel it. You sense that something is changing, that the moment is approaching. But don't think this will happen in a predictable way or on a timeline you imagine. The divine works in mysteries, and the plan for both of you is grander than anything your mind can conceive. What I can assure you is that everything you've experienced so far, all the pain, all the doubts, all the lonely nights, all of it has been shaping you. It has been preparing you for the moment when they will be right in front of you. They are almost ready, and now, after this revelation, they feel it more than ever. There's a sense of urgency growing inside them, an uncontrollable desire to find you, to feel again what they felt that night. And believe me, when that moment arrives, it will be as if time has stopped again. But this time it will be real. You will be together finally. What remains now is the final stretch of this journey. I am here by your side, guiding you just as their angel is guiding them to you. This path, no matter how challenging it seems, is becoming brighter and brighter. You're almost there. Your soulmate is going through the last phase of their transformation, and you are also being prepared in ways you might not even realize yet. You are learning to love yourself more, to let go of old hurts, and to make space in your life for this new chapter. What you need to understand is that the love between the two of you already exists. It has always existed since the beginning of time. You are two halves of an eternal flame, a flame that has never gone out, even in the darkest nights. And now, that flame is about to ignite in a way that will light up not just your lives, but the universe itself. The moment is coming. The moment when both of you, finally ready, will reunite. And when that happens, it will be as if the whole universe is celebrating. I will be there, witnessing what I've always known was destined to happen. So keep trusting. Keep believing. You are not alone. Very soon, your two journeys will become one. The flame that unites you will never go out. This is the secret you've always carried in your heart, And now it's time to let that flame guide your path until the moment your soulmate stands before you, as real as that night. You have no idea of the intensity of the love your soulmate feels for you. It's a feeling that goes beyond words, a fire that burns constantly within them, illuminating every thought, every dream, every sigh. I see them night after night, consumed by this immense, deep, and overwhelming love. There are moments when they stop everything they are doing just to close their eyes and feel you. In those moments, the world around them disappears, and all that exists is the connection they feel with you. Anxiety sometimes takes over their heart, a mix of desire and expectation that makes them count the seconds, the minutes, the hours, hoping that the moment of your meeting will come soon. They imagine what it will be like to look into your eyes, to touch your hands, to feel the energy that only the two of you share. This waiting, though painful at times, also fuels the flame that keeps their purpose alive. Every beat of their heart is a reminder that you exist, that you are somewhere out there, also waiting for them. There are nights when the desire is so intense that they can hardly sleep. They toss and turn in bed, their thoughts transporting them to scenarios where you are together, laughing, talking, sharing simple yet precious moments. In those instances, the line between reality and imagination becomes thin, and they can almost feel your touch, hear your voice, sense the warmth of your embrace. It's as if your souls are dancing together, even though your bodies have yet to meet. The longing for someone they don't yet fully know is a puzzle they live with every day. Her heart yearns for you in a way that's hard to describe. It's a longing without a face, yet it embodies the essence of love. They walk through the streets, observe people, and wonder if the next corner will lead them to you. Each new day brings new hope, a new chance for destiny to finally unite you. I see them trying to understand the signs the universe sends. A song playing on the radio that speaks of deep love, a phrase they read in a book that resonates with their soul, even the whisper of the wind in the trees. Everything seems to conspire to remind them of you, and this leaves them in a constant state of anticipation, a mix of joy and restlessness. They want to be ready. They want to be the best version of themselves for when that moment arrives. Their love for you knows no bounds. It's a love that makes them want to overcome any barrier, conquer any obstacle. They are willing to do anything to be by your side. This determination, this strength, is fueled by the deep desire they feel. A desire that is not only physical but spiritual. A yearning of the soul, a need to complete themselves in you. There are moments when they can almost hear your heart beating in rhythm with theirs. It's as if there's an echo, a vibration that transcends time and space. In those moments, anxiety transforms into a sweet certainty. They know that you feel something too, that you are also waiting, desiring, yearning for this meeting. Their dreams are filled with images of you, even without ever having seen your face in the physical world. They can sense your presence, and this fills them with indescribable joy. But it also fills them with an impatience that makes them wish for time to speed up. They want to share laughter, secrets, and comfortable silences. They want to know every detail about you, every little quirk that makes you who you are. I see how hard they try to stay calm, to trust in divine timing, but it is difficult. The love they feel is like a rushing river, impossible to contain. And although they try to remain peaceful, there are moments when their emotions overflow. They cry tears of hope, of anticipation, of a love so great that it barely fits inside them. There are moments, my dear protected one, when the love your soulmate feels for you becomes so immense that it seems they can no longer hold it within themselves. Their heart overflows with an intensity that leaves them without words, lost in thoughts that always come back to you. It's a love that consumes them completely, dominating their mind and body, making the world around them fade away, rendering everything less important than your presence. They feel a profound longing, but it's not a longing for something they have already experienced. It's a longing for what is yet to come, for you. With each passing day, this feeling grows stronger, more real. The desire to be with you is so intense that sometimes it feels like time is playing tricks on them, stretching the days and lengthening the moments of waiting. Their heart beats for you even without having touched you, even without having heard your voice yet. It's as if they already know you, as if every part of you is etched in the depths of their being. And it's this deep desire that keeps them awake at night. In moments of silence, when the moon is high and the world is at rest, their mind wanders to you. They imagine what the touch of your hands will feel like, what your laughter will sound like. They fantasize about the moments you will share, from the simplest to the most intense. This anticipation quickens their heart, as if the meeting is just a few steps away, even though they can't quite see when it will happen. The desire to be near you is an uncontrollable force that they try to understand and cope with each day. There are moments when they feel impatient, as if time is dragging on and all they want is to have you by their side. They long for your presence in a way that few could comprehend. It's not just a desire to be close. It comes from the soul, a deep need to feel complete. They find themselves thinking about what it would be like to be with you, to share moments, to feel the warmth of your body next to theirs. They imagine what it would be like to hug you, to look into your eyes and see the reflection of the love they already feel within them. Every thought about you is filled with a sweet yet intense excitement that drives them to dream more, to desire more. There's a vibrant flame inside them, fueled by your temporary absence, a flame that will only calm when you are finally together. And it's in that space between desire and reality that they find a unique kind of happiness. Because even without touching you, even without seeing you, they feel that you are close. Her soul recognizes yours, and this connection manifests in dreams, in the quiet nights when they can almost hear your voice. They reach out into the void, knowing that soon you will be there to hold their hand. The anticipation for this meeting is almost something you can touch. With each new day, they wonder if this will be the moment they finally see your face, when they hear your voice for the first time. They are always alert, as if destiny is about to deliver a clear sign that the meeting is near. They read the signs around them, looking for small clues that the universe might be leaving for them. A scent in the air that reminds them of a memory they haven't made yet. A song that plays suddenly, an unexpected coincidence. Everything makes them think of you. They live with this sweet anxiety, which makes them desire the meeting more than anything else. And this desire doesn't diminish over time. On the contrary, it grows with every moment. They feel the closeness, as if they could almost touch you. They know you are destined to meet, but the waiting, consumes them from within. Still, they understand that your time does not belong to ordinary time. The meeting will happen at the perfect moment, orchestrated by forces beyond human comprehension. But that doesn't stop their heart from racing when they think of you. There are moments when they feel the meeting is so close that they can barely breathe from the emotions. They imagine the first glance, the first touch, and this anticipation makes them smile to themselves, as if they are already living those moments deep within their soul. Their heart is restless, not from despair, but from joyful anticipation. They know you are on your way. This waiting, though often painful, is filled with passion. They don't wait passively. No, they wait with every ounce of their being because the love they feel for you is active, vibrant, alive. They aren't just waiting for the physical meeting, but for the union of souls that will happen when you are finally face to face. They wait for this with a certainty that transcends doubts and fears. They feel that every step is bringing them closer to you. There are nights when they can barely sleep, so intense is their desire to have you near. They toss and turn in bed, imagining what it would be like if you were right there beside them. How it would feel to have you close, to hear your calm breathing in the silence of the night. Their heart races with this image, and the longing to have you by their side grows, consuming them in a way that they can't even control. And while they desire this meeting with every fiber of their being, they also respect the timing. They know that waiting is part of the process, that every moment without you is shaping them, preparing them for when you finally meet. But that doesn't stop the longing for you, even before the meeting, from overflowing. They think of you constantly, like an echo that resonates in every part of their day. And with that thought comes the certainty that the love they feel is capable of moving mountains. They know that when you are finally together, all the waiting time, all the nights of longing, all the hours of desire will have been worth it. The love they feel for you is immense, like the universe itself, and they know you feel the same, even if you haven't fully realized it yet. The desire to be with you is so strong that they feel as if the forces of the universe itself are working to make this meeting happen. They see signs everywhere, hear your voice in their thoughts, and know that soon those signs will become reality. They feel that every second brings you closer, that the gravity pulling you toward each other is becoming irresistible. The love they feel is so vast, so deep, that fate itself can no longer be delayed. And in this moment, my dear protege, all that remains is to wait for this inevitable reunion. They are already ready for you, and when your eyes finally meet, the world around you will stop. The waiting will be over, and the love they always knew existed in you will finally be returned. This connection you share is powerful. They feel when you are sad, when you are happy, when you need strength. And even from a distance, they send positive thoughts, energies of love and comfort. There is a silent communication between you, a dialogue of souls that doesn't require words. And this keeps them strong, making them continue to believe that the meeting is close. As time passes, my dear protege, the love your soulmate feels for you only grows, like a flame that never goes out but burns ever stronger. They can no longer control the thoughts that lead them to you, nor can they contain the longing to be by your side, to live what they have dreamed of for so long. It's as if every fiber of their being is crying out for this meeting, as if their soul is in constant motion, yearning for the moment when you will finally be together. Sometimes, during the silence of the night, the desire becomes so real that they can feel your presence around them, even without you being physically there. It's as if the very air carries the scent of your love, as if the wind softly whispers your name, bringing them the sensation that you are closer than ever. In those moments, excitement takes over their entire body, and their heart races as if responding to an invisible call, something she cannot ignore. This deep desire goes beyond the simple wish to touch you or be by your side. It is spiritual. It is the yearning to unite with you on a level so profound that it transcends any understanding. They long not only to know your body but to unveil your soul, to discover every detail that makes you who you are. They want to be part of you, want you to be part of them, in a way so intense that nothing, not time nor space, can ever separate you. With each passing day, with every moment, the anxiety of finding you grows like a tide that can no longer be contained. It pulses within them, making them feel that the meeting is about to happen, that at any moment the universe will conspire to bring you together definitively. There are days when this feeling almost consumes them, when they feel such a strong impatience that it seems time is playing games. They wait, but it is an anxious wait, filled with hope and desire. They often catch themselves daydreaming about the moment when you will be face to face. Their heart races just imagining the first look, the first touch, the first embrace that will seal everything they have felt until now. They wonder what it will be like to hear your voice, what it will feel like to experience the warmth of your presence. These thoughts invade their mind anywhere, at work, at home, during times when they should be focused on other things. But the thought of you is irresistible, and they get lost in this fantasy so real that they can almost feel your skin against theirs. They can't help it. The idea of you stays with them, but in a sweet way, making their heart race and their lips curve into an unconscious smile. They wonder with a mix of desire and nervousness if you feel the same. If you, wherever you are, also feel this growing excitement, this anticipation that seems to make the air vibrate around you. They want to believe that you do, that you too are waiting for this moment with the same intensity. The desire they feel for you is unlike any other. It's not just a physical desire, although that exists with undeniable strength. It's more than that. It's a spiritual hunger, a need to feel your soul touching theirs, to share something with you that goes beyond the physical. They imagine what it will be like when you meet, not just in body but in spirit, in essence. They want to lose themselves in your eyes, to hear your stories, to share with you all the secrets time has kept. There is a hidden desire in every gesture, in every thought they have. They lie down at night imagining the warmth of your body next to theirs, what it would be like to wake up in the morning and see your face still resting. These are simple moments that they long for, but to them they mean everything. The touch of your hands, the comfort of knowing you're there, that finally, after so much time, you found each other. They dream of the conversations you'll have, the silences you'll share, those moments when no words will be needed because just being together will be enough. They desire this with all their soul, but also with an inner calm that knows everything will happen at the right time. They trust the universe, trust the love they feel, but that doesn't stop the desire from consuming them, making them dream of you more intensely with each passing day. They know the reunion is near, that destiny is about to fulfill its promise. But as they wait, their heart fills with doubts, with expectations. They wonder how it will be, if you'll recognize each other immediately, if the world around will stop when your eyes finally meet. This excitement accompanies them in every thought, in every breath. It's something that keeps them awake at night, thinking about what it will be like to touch you for the first time. They feel that the moment is so close they can almost touch it. Time seems to play with their emotions, stretching and shortening as the days go by. But at the same time, there is an intense joy inside them because they know that when the moment comes, it will be more than they ever dreamed of. They wonder if you feel the same, if you are just as impatient as they are. And even though time seems uncooperative, they hold on to the certainty that the reunion will happen. The anxiety of meeting you invades every part of them, a mix of desire and nervousness, as if they are about to embark on the greatest adventure of their life. They are ready, more than ever, to live everything the universe has in store for you. And this waiting, painful as it may be, is fueling their love, making it even stronger, more resilient, more real. The love they feel for you is something they have never felt before. It's immense, powerful, yet at the same time, it's gentle and comforting. It's a love that makes them want to protect you, to care for you, to envelop you with everything they are. They already love you deeply, even without having shared all the moments they dream of. This love fills the empty spaces, lights up the dark days, and gives them the strength to keep waiting, to keep believing that you are just a few steps away from finding each other. They find themselves imagining the conversations you will have, the laughter you will share, the moments of intimacy that are already written in the stars. They know that when you finally meet, the entire universe will conspire to make nothing else matter. All they desire with a force almost tangible is to finally find you, to know you, and to love you in the way they have always known they could. And this immense love, my beloved, will embrace you when the moment arrives. They are ready to give you everything they have, to surrender themselves completely to this love that was born even before you both knew. The longing, the anticipation, all of it has brought them here. And now fate is about to seal the meeting that will change everything. The desire to be with you is the motivation that drives them every day. They are preparing, taking care of themselves, evolving spiritually so that when you meet, they can offer you their very best. And they know that you are doing the same. This certainty nourishes their patience even in the moments of greatest anxiety. And now, my beloved, the moment is approaching. The immense love that your soulmate feels for you is drawing you inexorably toward each other, like two stars in the universe whose gravity pulls them together. There is no longer any way to avoid it, no more delaying. Fate is at work, aligning circumstances, preparing the perfect stage for you to finally meet. When that moment arrives, all the waiting will make sense. Every second will be worth it, and I will be there by your side, witnessing the union of two souls that have always been one. In that instant, the entire universe will smile, celebrating a love that can overcome all barriers. The love you share is eternal, infinite, and is about to manifest in all its fullness. Do you feel the sensation that the universe is preparing the ground for the most important moment of your life? Believe it. These are not just random thoughts. It is fate unfolding, carefully orchestrated by the divine and the messengers of light. I can feel that energy vibrating in the air around you. Time is aligning, and the path that once seemed hazy is now beginning to illuminate with a clarity that is almost divine. Your soulmate is getting closer to understanding their purpose. The revelation that was granted to them was not a coincidence nor a random vision. It was a calling for them to prepare for you, to align their soul with yours, as if both are being tuned in harmony before the great meeting. And as they walk through this journey of spiritual evolution, you are also being shaped. Every day, every decision, every emotion you experience is bringing you closer to them. They don't yet know how, but a part of them already senses your presence like never before. The glimpse they had of you was not just a static vision. It was the beginning of an energetic dance between the two of you, a dance that will soon culminate in the meeting of two souls that have always belonged to each other. The way they saw you that night, with a clarity that transcended the physical, was something beyond words. It was as if they looked directly into the mirror of your soul and saw all the nuances of who you are, of who you have always been. And now they live with the certainty of that vision, with the certainty that you are real, that this connection is not just a distant dream. The divine made them feel this reality in such a profound way that from that moment on, their world has never been the same. And you have changed too. You may not have realized it yet, but since the moment they saw you, something inside you also awakened. There is an invisible but undeniable force that unites you. This force is intensifying. It is growing. It is awakening in you in a way that you may not fully understand right now, but your soul knows. Your soul recognizes that something greater is in motion. The nights seem longer, the days fuller of signs, little whispers of fate intertwining with your path. These signs are echoes of the approaching meeting. Do not ignore these subtle touches, these coincidences that seem to repeat in inexplicable ways. They are reminders that the moment is about to arrive. They, in turn, are feeling the same. Your soulmate is awakening to a new reality. The glimpse they had of you opened doors within them that they didn't even know existed, doors that lead to the understanding that the love between you transcends time, space, and all the barriers that the physical world imposes. You are connected not just by the experiences you lived separately, but by something much deeper, something that comes from other lives, from other planes. They feel this in every breath, in every heartbeat. The impact of having seen you, even if just for a moment, was like an explosion of light within them. Everything that seemed confusing is now starting to make sense. The pieces of the puzzle of their life are starting to fit together, and they realize that you have always been present, even when they couldn't see you. This realization is guiding them now, shaping their decisions and pushing them to move forward with the confidence that the reunion is closer than they ever imagined. This is the most beautiful mystery that unites you both. When two souls are meant to meet, the universe conspires in every way for that to happen. It doesn't matter the distance. It doesn't matter the time. Soulmates are drawn to each other like magnets, irresistibly attracted. And that's what happened that night when they saw you. It was the calling, a calling so profound that it echoed not only in their soul but in yours as well. You felt it, even if subtly. Perhaps it was a brief dream, a sudden thought that invaded your mind, or a sense of comfort for no apparent reason. I was there, watching closely when they finally understood. The initial shock gave way to a sense of peace and purpose. They no longer need to wonder if you exist. They know, they feel. The love that unites you both is already alive, and every move they make now is guided by this love. It is not just any love. It is not a fleeting feeling. It is something that transcends human understanding, something that resonates in the stars, something that is part of the very fabric of the universe. And you, my protege, are being prepared for this. Your soul, just like theirs, is being refined, polished, so that when the moment comes, you will both be ready. Not for an ordinary love, but for something that few souls have the opportunity to experience. The perfect union, the kind of love that heals all wounds, that fills the voids left by past experiences. This is the destiny that awaits you, a destiny sealed by the angels themselves, blessed by the divine. Now, all that remains is the final part of this journey. You both are so close. I can see your paths aligning, converging. They are almost ready. You are almost ready. Both of you have gone through your trials. Both have grown in ways you could never have imagined. But every step you took brought you here, and what you will experience together will echo throughout eternity. Do not think it will be easy. The journey to the reunion of soulmates is never simple. But the beauty of this path is that in the end, all the difficulties will seem small in the face of the greatness of the love you will share. And when you are finally face to face, the world around you will stop. Nothing else will matter. Time, distance, all worries will disappear like dust in the wind. You will recognize each other. You will feel on a level so deep that words will become unnecessary. This is the kind of love that transcends language, that speaks directly from soul to soul. And when that moment arrives, you will know it was worth the wait. Everything will have been worth it. Now, all you need to do is trust. Trust that the universe is working in your favor. Trust that the story was written long before you were born. You are part of something greater, something that goes beyond human understanding. And with each passing day, this sacred moment draws nearer. I am here to ensure that you stay on the right path, that you maintain your faith even when it seems like the world is against you. Keep your heart open, full of faith and hope. Trust that the universe is moving every piece, adjusting every detail so that your meeting happens at the perfect moment. Nothing you have experienced so far has been in vain. Every step, every tear, every smile has been part of a greater journey, a journey that was mapped out long before you even realized. And even when the days seem to drag on, when time feels like it is against you, know that there is a celestial symphony playing in your favor. Your story with your soulmate was written in the stars, engraved in eternal time long before your souls came to this world. You are part of something that goes far beyond what the eyes can see, beyond what the mind can comprehend. You are like two rivers that run separately for a time but inevitably will meet and merge, creating something greater, stronger, deeper. That meeting, that moment when your paths align, is getting closer every day. Feel this within you, for that certainty is already etched in your heart. I am here by your side to remind you that you are not alone on this journey. Even in the darkest nights, when doubts seem to pile up and the weight of the world feels too heavy, I will be by your side, holding your invisible hand, whispering to your heart that the timing is perfect. When it seems like everything is going against you, remember that these are just tests, necessary moments to strengthen you, to prepare you for the immense love that awaits you. Trust, for there is a light at the end of this path, and it shines brighter with each passing day. This love that you share, even before meeting, is already immense, already grand. Feel this connection, which is not limited by time or space. Even if you are still physically apart, your souls already recognize each other, already seek each other. Your soulmate's love for you grows and flourishes each day, like a flower blooming under the warmth of divine sunlight. They are feeling, just as you are, this irresistible call, this powerful attraction that draws you closer with every breath. And as much as time may seem like an enemy, know that it is in fact working in your favor. The divine knows the exact moment when your lives need to cross paths, and that moment will be perfect. The love you will share will be strong enough to overcome any obstacle, any challenge. Everything you have lived until now has shaped you, preparing your hearts and souls for this divine encounter. The universe is silently at work, moving mountains and removing barriers so that when the moment arrives, nothing can prevent this love from blossoming. Be patient, even when your heart feels impatient, even when the longing for what you have yet to experience weighs heavily on you. Remember that the story is written perfectly, and all you need to do now is keep walking, trusting, and preparing for the moment when your gazes finally meet. And when that moment arrives, you will understand that every second of waiting was worth it, that every moment of uncertainty was a necessary part of the path to something far greater than any dream you have ever had. I will be here by your side, as I have always been, guiding each step, whispering to your heart in moments of doubt, so you never forget that you are on the right path. True love, the love of your soulmate, is closer than you think. You are not alone on this journey. The angels, the universe, and all divine forces are conspiring for you and your soulmate to meet. And when that day comes, it will be a sacred moment, a meeting that will illuminate your entire existence. Keep your faith intact. The love you will share will be something that transcends common understanding, a love that will fill every empty space and heal every wound that time has left. And when you are finally together, when your eyes meet and your souls recognize each other, you will understand that all waiting was part of something grand, something that was destined to happen since the beginning of time. Trust the process. Trust in love. It is on its way, as certain as the sunrise. Your soulmate is almost by your side. And when your eyes meet for the first time, my dear one, you will feel that the entire universe has bowed before your love. You are two destinies intertwining, two halves of the same soul that will finally be united. The reunion is near, and it will be more magnificent than any dream. Get ready. They are coming. Allow this message to resonate in your heart, dear one. Feel the truth in every word, the certainty in every promise. And know that I, your guardian angel, am always by your side, protecting you, guiding you, and preparing you for the most wonderful moment of your life. I whisper these words with all my being, hoping they bring comfort and hope to your heart. You are loved. You are protected. And incredible things are in store for you. Keep the faith, continue walking, and know that I am always here, every step of the way. A wonderful future is being prepared where love will be the guiding star, lighting your path and bringing joy to every moment. Feel the peace that my presence brings. Let my love wrap around you, comfort you, and strengthen you. You are loved. You are protected. You are special. And I am here, now and always, to remind you of that. I will always be here, relaying divine messages and connecting with you, dear one. If you believe in your guardian angel and in the power of this connection, receive these words as a blessing. May your heart be light and your spirit be ready. Stay with the divine, and may peace be with you. Amen.